Okay, so welcome. We're here on February 12th, 2022 at the home of Virginia Nazarea. This is, I believe, the sixth in a series of conversations about the origins and development of food anthropology, sponsored by the Society for the Anthropology of Food and Nutrition. And I'm here with Professor Nazarea in Athens, Georgia, where she was a professor of anthropology, recently retired. And I wanted to talk to you, Virginia, today a little bit about I think maybe the different trajectory that led you to food anthropology, because you did your PhD at the University of Kentucky, and your interest, you started out with an interest in agriculture, and so what brought you into anthropology at first?
Okay, well, my undergrad was in biology, and then I taught, some courses in zoology and ecology, and I guess I was always interested in.
This was in the Philippines?
This was in the Philippines, and so I guess I was always kind of interested in, like, meanings people make. And so, and by the way, I was always interested in literature, and so when this idea of environmental anthropology came up, it was to me a very, very attractive option. So then I started my graduate training at Purdue University. Worked with Merdine Anderson, who's a student of Hal Conklin. And then my attachment to ethnoscience came very early on. Ethnoscience, ethnoecology, the way people make meanings of things, the way they categorize things, and therefore, based on their categorization, act on those things and behave in the environment. That has always been my interest. And then I went to the University of Kentucky, and I thought I was working with James Foster and Billy DeWalt, but they were gone. And so I worked with Susan Abbott, and Susan is a psychological anthropologist. And so I continued my interest in terms of ethnobiology, but also agricultural decision making. And I was very interested in how perceptions of both opportunities and constraints are influenced by a person's class and gender and age, and how decision making is always situated. So that was my dissertation research, which is agricultural decision making in this apparently homogeneous population of farmers in the Philippines, but it was actually homogeneous only on the surface. This farming system was practically at the backyard of the International Rice Research Institute, also at the backyard of the University of the Philippines, which had a College of Agriculture. So you can imagine that there's a lot of, research and extension efforts in this rice farming community. Plus, it was just in the throes of agrarian reform. And so what looked like an egalitarian community was in fact very, very much stratified in terms of access to property. There were new owners. We call them amortizing owners. There was one landowner, of course. He was absentee.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were a lot of landless people on the fringes. So that's what I studied. I studied decision making with reference to both rice farming and tilapia aquaculture, tilapia nilotica, in this area. And like I said, I studied it in terms of both gender and class.
Mm-hmm.
And then, well, from there, should I go on?
Well, I get the sense that you were, as you said, you were looking at categories and decision making, and drawing on some of these cognitive and psychological ideas, and then you started to incorporate more interpretive and embodied approaches in your research, and can you talk about how that formed as a idea for you? Was it things that happened in the field, or things that were happening in the field of anthropology that stimulated you to?
Okay, yeah. I mean, I could say that formally, the more embodied, interpretive part of my work came much later, because I was trained in, ethnoscience, established my lab, ethnoecology and biodiversity lab, based on categorization of plants, which is why I had an herbarium there. But outside of that formal shift, I think the embodiment came very early on, because I started my dissertation as a young mom, and I guess as anthropologists we're supposed to see the difference, right? All I could see was sameness. All I could see was mothers playing with their kids, even if they didn't really know where their next meal was coming from. And also, even though I was studying like categories, how should I say? I was following Eugene Hahn in terms of categories embodying action plans. That based on a category, you can almost decide, kind of decipher what the action will be, and which is the power of ethnoscience, of course. But the categories shaded into each other, and also were very much affected by the person's relationship to the plant or the resource based on where he was in the scheme of things, or she was. It's like, Bourdieu said that the people are classifiers, but we classify according to how we are classified. So, for example, landless people would classify plants based on itchiness. Landed people would classify rice varieties, for example, based on their performance in the market, or extension people would classify it based on staying power. It's like you don't need taste. As long as it stays there, that's good for you. The how should I say, the tenants or the new owners would classify it based on special versus non-special. Like special rices, which are glutinous and aromatic, they're for special people. They're not for us. And then the landless would classify it based on, like I said, because they were day laborers, they would classify it based on the itchiness, when they traverse that rice paddy. Or toys. I mean, like butterflies as something to play with, to chase for their kids. So even though that kind of formal transition professionally came about, I think much later, this kind of embodied relationship to the natural resources as situated realities came to me pretty early on.
Another thing that I feel is very innovative in your work is that you were looking at food from the perspective of growing food, but that wasn't separated from thinking about food from the perspective of eating food, which is two different fields in anthropology.
I see, yeah.
And so I wonder where you made that connection. I think I saw something you published as in the early 1990s, where you said agronomy also has to include ethnogastronomy, and you were conceptualizing biodiversity. I don't know if that came later as a framework, biodiversity, but very much while thinking about the sensory aspects of biodiversity conservation. So I'd love to hear kind of where those different streams came together for you.
Okay. Yes. I must say it was impossible to avoid. Because when you talk to folks, to farmers, about the varieties, I will start with the rice, but then I will proceed to sweet potato, which was my next focus. When you talk about, say, land use change or varietal change, you cannot get very far from this relationship of farmers as consumers, not just as producers of food, which is, I think, what people try to think of them, especially in terms of the kind of agricultural development and extension framework. I-64, IR-64 was it, or IR-48, the rice varieties that were bred to be dwarf and high yielding and able to, and how should I say, not photosensitive, so that they could be planted twice. They were meant, of course, for production. They were meant so that they would translate each input into harvestable biomass, which is good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, because they were able to build stone houses and they were able to educate their kids. But they did think a lot about, varieties that tasted good, that slipped down through their throat, in other words, not, how should I say, not hard and dense. And they would think about, snacks that people used to prepare in olden times. And so they were using these categories to decide on what varieties they would plant. Or they would reserve certain rows of their farms for the plants they wanted, the varieties they desired, and then separated off, certain parts for the market. So ingenious were they in doing this that sometimes a clump of rice plants would have like the varieties they wanted in the center, surrounded by the approved varieties. I mean, you would say that the market is a, what do you call this? An invisible hand, free hand?
Yeah,
You know?
invisible.
Invisible hand. But there were ways around that because the insurance people and the extension people who determined their credit worthiness never really got their feet wet. And so they were able to, get the credit, but at the same time have some. It wasn't a perfect solution, but they tried, to have what they wanted. Other than that, they would say that, well, it's for special people, which for me was kind of really sad. And then I got interested in biodiversity, specifically crop biodiversity. I'll digress a little bit, okay? The reason that I got interested in biodiversity was I visited the International Rice Research Institute. This was a long time ago, maybe late 80s, early 90s. And they had something like, 84,000 varieties at that point.
Where was that?
This was in my hometown, Los Baños, Laguna, in the Philippines. And the deposit was, really, really well protected. I mean, in a vault and all that. And the other thing I noticed was that the accessions, the plants, they're called accessions, had passport data, which had really minimal information, like the collector, the habitat, nothing about how this was used or how this was managed. Even though if you ask any seasoned plant collector, they will tell you that the best way to get to your specimen is to ask the local people. But all that was canceled in the passport data. So that when I had a chance to actually, look into this, and this was with Upward. It's a user's perspective with agricultural research and development, and this was a project by CIP, Centro Internacional de la Papa, or International Potato Center in the Philippines, involving a network of Asian social scientists. So then when I had that chance, kind of a more free hand, I wanted to be able to flesh out that bare bones passport data. And this is where the memory banking came in. I wanted to flesh out this passport data with cultural information that was cleansed from it. Probably, I mean, not with any malicious intent, but just cleansed in the name of science from it, as it was archived, as they were archived in the gene bank. And so with potatoes, we paid real attention to the knowledge of people and why they kept certain varieties. And in that research, we studied two communities. One was a subsistence area and one was a commercializing area. And I mean, the question was, why does sweet potato diversity persist, even though all wisdom, economic wisdom, would tell you to concentrate on the recommended varieties, but the varieties did persist. And so still cognitively, I looked at how they define what's desirable and what's not through several ethno-scientific methods. And one thing that I found out is that people were fuzzy in their decision making. I mean, it's not a clear paradigm or a clear, decision making tree, because, for example, they would say, I like this variety because it's sweet, But I also like this variety because it's not sweet, it's bland. But when there's no rice, when we can't buy rice, it's better to use the bland varieties because then we can use it with, with anything. With and rice is more pricey, of course, than sweet potatoes because you can cultivate it on your own. So then somebody would say that, this variety produces only small sweet potatoes, but on the other hand, either it's very, very delicious or it has leaves that can be used for medicine, can be used as a salve for the skin, can be used as a vegetable. So in other words, there were criteria that were, I like this because, but I like that because, or I like this because, but this is also good.
They were contingent and contextual.
Yes.
It wasn't just taste. It was many things.
Everything. And then also their agricultural cycle, like when the potato is planted, depended on many, many things. Like, like when the moon is full, you'll have potatoes that are big, or sometimes you even have to look at the eyes of the cat, But there was a lot of contingency in the thing, which of course we should expect because that's how we decide. But for some reason, we want their decision-making criteria to be neat and plottable, right? And so I came into this kind of thinking that it's actually the diversity of, the criteria, the preferences, the relationship to the plants, because such a thing existed. Like, for example, they talked about sweet potatoes as guapo or handsome, beautiful. This sweet potato is beautiful, and you can't make them say why it's beautiful. It's just so, and so there are this criteria which is really without measure, and this is good for biodiversity because then it makes biodiversity persist in in our world as we like it, and so we documented the diversity through life histories, through triads test, a classical ethno-scientific method, ethno-semantic games in which we would ask a person to hold up a sweet potato, for example, to someone who is not looking, but then there's someone looking, and that person will describe the potato until the sweet potato until this person figures it out. So because it's under time pressure and with a price, of course, they will use the most salient category.
I see.
And so, again, like you said, it's almost, how should I say? It doesn't require a cognitive leap for one to think of crops as food, or for one to figure out that, taste and smell and beauty and all those things are part of what makes people plant, this kind of varieties.
Right. It doesn't require that leap, and yet so few people took the leap at that time that you were taking. And I liked in that book, The Cultural Memory and Biodiversity, how you presented some of these criteria that you had collected from the people to the scientists, and had them say, oh, well, this one I have no comment, or this one it's okay, it probably doesn't do any harm, but they had a very hard time incorporating that into
No scientists are friends of mine. I mean, I think we're again, no less than the people that we study. We're bred in our certain environment, right? And we think based on those environments in which we were raised. It's quite adaptive and quite simple. Even in my most recent work at the International Potato Center, where I'm studying the repatriation of traditional land races back to the Cusco farmers who were their original custodians.
In Peru.
In Peru, yeah. The gene bank was in Lima. The repatriation site Cusco is in the Andes. But I made it a point to, like, if I asked the farmers to draw the varieties again, so that I would understand the cultural salience of certain features of varieties, if I made them draw, I would make the scientists draw, and I would make the, well, not make, ask, and I would make the NGOs, the nonprofits, draw. Or if I had life histories there, I would do life histories at the center, at the International Potato Center, and they would say, come, we can have free therapy, they called it. The scientists called it free therapy, to be able to say their life histories. But how should I say? I think everybody is just kind of trying to come at it from however they were raised or however they were conditioned to think. And it's interesting to find out, the translation of concepts, sometimes the clash, sometimes the complementarity. For example, I interviewed a scientist, very well known, Carlos Ochoa, who's, I think, contributed more than anybody else to the gene bank in Peru in terms of potatoes, and is it sweet potatoes too? And he was very sentimental about those potatoes that he collected, very sentimental and nostalgic about his breeding. He did plant breeding of potatoes, and he gave them such names as Renacimiento, or, coming back. One he named after once people say his nanny, but what he told me was the wife of the Incan rebel that the Spaniards kind of tore apart.
Oh, yes. What is his name?
Tupac Amaru.
Right.
The wife of Tupac Amaru. As the wife watched, they tied his appendages to horses that went in different directions. So anyway, he named one of the potatoes that he bred for her. And he always said he starts from potatoes that, not from the orthodox breeding lines, because plant breeders have such a thing, but from potatoes that farmers have feelings for. So in other words, the sentiments undergird not just the local farmers, but also some scientists, maybe many.
I see. I want to pick up on some of those ideas, because one of the things that I got a sense from from some of this work that you're talking about with the sweet potatoes was that it was partly even if there were scientists who would not fit into this category, but it was a critique of modernity, and I wonder if how much this was influenced by James Scott and ideas about vernacular knowledge or situated knowledge, or other people. You talk in memory and the cultural memory and biodiversity about the issue of abstraction and forgetting. At one point, I think you say that there is this concern with loss, and you say that the knowledge is lost before the actual crop itself. So Maybe you could just talk a little bit about what was influencing you from a
Okay.
theoretical perspective there.
Okay. I go back and forth in terms of laws. See, to justify the need that I saw for us to document the knowledge of farmers, I argued that, especially with rice, but also with other things like sweet potatoes, the difference, of course, is that rice is a crop that was the subject of a lot, actually international, crop development and extension, whereas sweet potato is a more marginal crop. And the only thing that affected it in terms of modernization was market integration. There was some breeding of potatoes, of sweet potatoes, but not as much as rice. And so I wanted to argue in terms of rice that the farmers who knew anything about the rice varieties that we had before Green Revolution took over and introduced the high-yielding, crops, varieties, they are libraries that are about to close. I mean, in 1982, I said in my book they were in their 50s. And that was what, late 1980s maybe? So how many years are we from now? So that kind of knowledge is fading away or gone. But on the other hand, I told you about, people that would plant the favored varieties in the middle of crop of plants that were approved by the extension and credit people. And never mind that the favored varieties was purple stalked, whereas the favored varieties were green stalked. They couldn't tell. The extension people, and the credit people couldn't tell. And so I refer to this as something like weapons of the weak, following James Scott, that peasants, even if they're subject to power structures, have their own ways. Foot dragging, gossip, stealth, theft, to be able to subvert. Anne Gold talks about this too in her book, which I love, in Memories of Trees and Sorrow, wherein the people would carry seeds in dung, cow dung, just so that they would not be detected. So I was following Scott in that manner, in terms of people not completely buying into the dominant structure or the dominant discourse, but having ways by which they subvert such discourse. In my later work, like for example, heirloom seeds and their keepers, I talk about a little kind of difference in that, and Ortner talks about this too, that there's no one power structure and therefore there's no one resistance. That power structures are spread out and sometimes incongruous, and resistance is the same. So and also because of my field work, of course, I was noticed, and I developed this in Heirloom Seeds and Their Keepers. I noticed that it's not just resistance. This weapons of the weak, sometimes they're not weapons. Sometimes they're not for the powers that be. Sometimes the people are just digging in and finding a way by which they can live their lives the way they want to. And a lot of joy is involved in that, a lot of yearning and a lot of joy. It's not always with an eye to the master, you know. Sometimes they don't care about the master.
Right.
I mean, you know, and I think we should take note of that. That sometimes this has nothing to do with Monsanto. I mean, they don't waste time with Monsanto. They plant because they want those plants. And this also made me like kind of go full circle in terms of the cultural dimensions of biodiversity, because I started out, I mean, coming from my biological, ecological background, I started out thinking that cultural memory and this diverse, criteria for crop choice, these are necessary for buttressing diversity against all the forces that make it disappear. Market integration, extension credit, so on and so forth. So I thought of this criteria as something that would buttress biological diversity against loss. But then I came to this sort of kind of the other thinking that in fact, I don't know if it's more importantly or just as importantly, the biodiversity is needed for people to live out their lives meaningfully. So this is not just an instrument for this, but this in fact is needed for that.
Right.
And maybe that was the point also, David, when I formally became more, kind of defined in terms of, the kind of the embodied, the sensuous, because it is, how should I say, life is incomplete without, for example, the kind of varieties that are, say, for special occasions or for food, or feeding the baby his first or her first spoonful of solid food, or, just pretty to look at, things that jump out at you. We were talking.
Yeah, for the potatoes, the sweet potatoes, you said, so people would say, "Oh, these ones are good for snacks,"
Yeah.
or "These ones are good for the kids."
These ones are good for the kids, and so while those criteria buttress biodiversity, which is important for all of us, of course, there is this other aspect that the all those varieties are needed to live a meaningful life. And so, how should I say? Yeah, those, for example, those potato varieties in Cusco, they swaddle them in blankets, they sing to them, they scold them. When they dare disappear and they're found again, they scold them. And so
and welcome them home like prodigal children.
They walk them up and down the slope. And oh yes, we were talking about theoretical contribution. Yes, I also liked very much Seremitaki's framework in terms of memory and the senses. And she talked about, memory as discordant notes. That's what, difference as discordant notes. So, for example, I documented something like, they like this sweet potato because it cracks when it's cooked. A biological scientist would say to me, well, so what? That's one person. I mean, it's anecdotal. Maybe it's true. Maybe it's deep. Maybe it's felt. But this is one person. What does it say in terms of biodiversity? But, reading Seremitakis, I followed her point that these are discordant notes. For as long as the landscape shows these discordant notes, there these brave little reminders, this tumble of greens and beans, as a kind of contest to linear monoculture, neat rows of this and that. For as long as they're there, when people see them, they are, how should I say, jarred from this, what Connerton says, forced amnesia. Because, like, forced amnesia denies us any choice prematurely because we're told or we're convinced that it isn't there. Connerton makes the point that all totalitarianisms depend on people forgetting. So I think it's very important that, different varieties like small potatoes or like weak panicles of rice, I think they're important. Not just in an anecdotal, fuzzy-warmy way, but because as long as they're there, people will see that there's a choice. People will see that there are things one need not forget. And in terms of my earlier work, I remember Hobsbawm, and he talked about, in peasant studies, and he talks about, the freedom is to understand your latitude of choice. So I think these jarring reminders expand the latitude of choice for people, be it with plants or with food. The fact that we are able to, for example, enjoy the food of our grandmother or the food of where we came from, that's very important in terms of kind of the other way, the way that biodiversity undergirds personal autonomy and sense of meaning. And,
Yeah.
and so in the end, I think it's about, digging in and welling up. And so I talk about, about nonchalance towards, the dominant structures, which is probably not possible all the time, but it's possible sometimes.
Well, let me just pick up on what you said about enjoying the food of our grandmothers and the food of where we come from. Just to ask you about, I feel like two of the key concepts that you've introduced or done, been a major part of bringing into anthropology is the idea first of in situ conservation as opposed to ex situ, which you described with the gene banks, and then later trans situ.
Yes.
So do you want to say a little bit about those?
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to say that ex situ conservation, I think, is important. There are natural calamities, there are wars, changes in fashion, changes in the food, and, like a good library. Books that have fallen into disfavor are still there, books that may be burned are still there. So let me just say at the outset that I am not kind of against ex situ conservation. I think it is very, very important. The thing is, first of all, it needs to be complemented by in situ conservation, or going a step further, in vivo conservation, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay. Like I said, first of all, it needs to be complemented. And here's another point not often recognized. We should acknowledge that ex situ conservation is not the source nor the end of biodiversity conservation,
Right.
not the beginning or the ultimate. Because I think that's the dangerous part. The dangerous part is when we say that, first of all, the diversity inheres in the gene banks, or that we have the ultimate storage in the gene banks. That, I think, is where it goes wrong. First of all, the diversity, if we're talking about agricultural crops, the diversity is nurtured in farmers' fields. And what's nurtured in farmers' fields is determined by what's cooked in the kitchen. So there's the freezer, there's the kitchen, there's the cold, there's the warmth, you know. So that warm sphere of conservation needs equal or more attention. And in vivo is when we recognize that, how should we say, that we can't have like programs like we want to do, like in situ conservation programs to complement ex situ conservation programs. That kind of programmatic approach sort of defies the whole spirit of what in situ is about. Because if you're trying to generalize so that you can promote, then you reduce this to something that can be, packaged and moved from one place to another. In situ is not a program. It is something that was there before, which is, I'm trying to make a point. It's something that was there before. It's something that persists. And in vivo conservation recognizes that because it doesn't occur in a vacuum, you cannot like cordon off a space or dictate an activity like women's home gardens, like that. Should be in this plot. What you need to do, or what we need to do, is encourage that complex of lifeways and complex of resources that allow for in situ conservation to persist. In other words, it's a matter of landscape, it's a matter of a place, and I don't know if the lessons are transmissible. I mean, this makes it, of course, maybe of less worth, but I really don't know if the lessons are transmissible. The only lesson I can think of is to allow that space, which even sounds a little paternalistic, because why would you allow to keep off? I mean, to make room for that kind of space to foster. And then, of course, so in vivo is that encouragement of that space wherein in situ conservation can prosper. And
I guess it's this. It would be the equivalent to me of like the idea that you could preserve cooking just by preserving recipes, rather than actually. You have to cook in order to preserve cooking, right?
Yeah. And you have to make a space. Like, for example, and this is really difficult to think about. But for example, say women in Ecuador need a whole day to prepare their sopas, their soup, because they boil down the vegetables and the meat. And then with the coming of the rose plantations, they work outside the home for most of the time. They come back. There's no time for soup. So, I mean, I certainly don't have the answer. But there's no, we need to allow that kind of space. And maybe also when I say marginality and resistance, oh, by the way, we lost bell hooks. Bell Hooks said that we need to think of a marginalities as a space not of deprivation but of power. So when we think of, say, women or subsistence farmers who are able to do things outside of what's required of them or outside of what's predicted for them, then, that kind of space is asserted, I think. That kind of space asserted. Oh, and this will be related to the other point, transit to conservation. There's a certain peculiar thing. For example, women from other countries come here and they've got to make a living, right? So they, get into the treadmill, so to speak, work long hours, try to, there was a Syrian student who came to me. He was a filmmaker, and he wanted to do this kind of film about biodiversity. And then he told me, he said, me and my mom were just coming back to cooking Syrian food. He said, because when we first came here, he was a child. And he said, when he first came here, for some reason, she convinced herself that you had to consume those, canned foods.
Yeah.
They were cleaner, they were more convenient. So he said, while I was growing up, we were consuming all those things. And then he said, now that I'm grown up, then we're slowly, we try to be strong in marginality. Sometimes we're not always successful, but then we can always go back. I know of some Filipino immigrants, for example, and here's your recipes too, because those recipes have a use. So the children who are grown now never had the chance of cooking with their mothers who were busy. They're Googling recipes from the Philippines and trying to cook it themselves. So what I'm saying is there's, how should I say, the creation of space which can be both a lesson for people who have power, like scholars and development workers and so on and so forth, to realize that conservation needs to be in vivo at the same time that it's in situ, but also that, for some peculiar reason, people assert it. And not always, as Scott says, not always to, to resist the powers that be. Sometimes it comes from the simple joy and need and yearning to dwell in that kind of space. And very briefly, in terms of trans situ conservation, what we're referring to is the conservation of plants that are transported. We all know how everyone's like just moving around, really. And so people carry their plants with them or are able to retrieve them when they get here, or anywhere for that matter. We had this research project called Introduce Germplasm from Vietnam, and we worked with students of Vietnamese ancestry in the University of Georgia. No, just the system, not just Georgia, Georgia State. And they went back to their elders and documented, the plants that they have and the cooking, that they did with the varieties from Vietnam. So that's another way. Trans situ conservation is conservation across space. And sometimes, like Vietnam is kind of very well developed now, a really modern country. Sometimes these reservoirs could, this trans situ reservoirs might even be able to conserve some of those varieties driven by sentiment, because many of them were political refugees, driven by sentiment, and become kind of a gene bank for transposition back home. I'm not sure, but these things are kind of possible.
Right, right. So in reading your work, one of the things that is striking to me is some of your use of metaphor, and even even given what you said about the importance of ex situ conservation, maybe you get at some of the dangers of prioritizing or seeing that as the most important or the thing in itself, through some of the metaphors that you use to talk about these issues. And I'm thinking in particular about some of the different kind of container metaphors that I feel run through your work. On the one hand, with the gene banks that are, as you said, emotionally or tonally cold rather than hot. In fact, they are cold. They're
layers of cold.
Literally cold. And you talked about cordoning off, and I feel like there are kind of containers there that are constricting or constraining, that are about keeping out contamination, versus the kind of containers that you describe in some of this work on the in vivo and in situ conservation, which maybe are more like the fuzzy sets that you were starting to think about in your cognitive and ethnoscience approaches, in that they envelop, they provide a sanctuary, which is one of the key terms in your recent collection. You even talk about the seed pod itself as a kind of sanctuary. It's a very, you talk about the cradling of the potatoes. Yeah. So there's all these ways that these are containers that are not constraining, but in some sense nurturing and empowering. And they are the kind of containers that suggest the embedding, which, to use a metaphor from Polanyi, but I feel like is the hallmark of a truly anthropological approach, that retains some sense of holism, even while recognizing the dangers of the whole as well. So I wonder if you had thought about that at all, or if it just kind of emerged from your...
Okay. The truth is, I never thought about containment again, at the end. But you're right. Okay, to go back, in terms of ex situ conservation, there's this principle of containment, like you said. Conservation is done in layers. Like there's a layer that's accessible to people and accessible for exchange. There's a layer that's like freezer, like cold. Like if you were to visit a gene bank, it would be like entering the freezer. And then there's a layer of deep cold. I mean, really deep cold, like liquid nitrogen. And there's a corresponding, in terms of building, there's a corresponding like interior. It goes more interior, and sometimes it goes deep into the ground in terms of protection. Another level of containment is you don't want contagion, like Harlan, who was a geneticist, a very well-known geneticist, and he talked about the immorality, the almost immorality of the unpure. Yeah. So the idea is to keep everything pure. And that's where the fear of contagion comes from. You don't want anything that would contaminate the purity of your lines, which makes sense, because if it's going to be used for plant breeding, you don't want kind of something of unknown origin to be there. Whereas I was interviewing this woman gardener. She had beans in Ecuador, and I said, so how many kinds of beans do you have there? And she says, I'll find out at the end, because she was open to this whole idea of, she doesn't call it contamination. I don't think she'll take kindly to that. But this whole idea of, breeding, new types coming. In other words, she hasn't been into this immorality of the impure. For her, this is the normal kind of thing. So that's how I've been thinking of the gene bank as containment versus biodiversity in the field as contagion, as a contagion of sentiment, a contagion of like needs, kind of wants, and what's beautiful, yearning and all that. Now you just brought up this point, which, like I said, I really didn't think of before, which is that when we talk about sanctuary, we do talk about a certain degree of coming together. I mean, it's not, in other words, it's not independent seeds. It's the garden that will be constructed and the relationships around that garden. Once that tree is planted, it's the kitchen, following your work, that will be enlivened by the product from the garden and all the relationships in that kitchen and all the transmission of memories in that kind of kitchen. So, in that sense, it's not pieces of, just random pieces of this and that. And we talked about this earlier between us, that there's also maybe that's where it comes from. Edward Casey talked about, he wrote this article as an introduction to that census of place. And what he said was, a space does not really precede place. It becomes place in very little time. As soon as you perceive it, it's a place, because you bring all your meanings, all your experiences, all your memories into that perception of the place. And so maybe I think of sanctuary in terms of that coherence following Casey, and that yearning to bring about a life world which makes sense to you.
That's where a sense of holism comes into.
Yes, and also this thing about, coming from psychology, about ecological mourning, that sense of grief and distress when something you're supposed to come to earth with, like your cohort, your more than human others are not there anymore. It's really, really distressing. The same as I tried to point out earlier, the fact that you can't find the potato that, that is good for you. So then, again, following Casey, I guess when I say sanctuary, I'm thinking of that kind of coherence and that kind of yearning. But it's also that kind of coherence and yearning that's made possible by the presence of, the seeds and the food and everything that gives us kind of a reason to wake up the following day.
Right.
You know, that kind of that what we yearn for.
Right, right.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely. Well, let me just ask you then, what questions do you have that are not yet answered for you? What questions kind of drive your interest into the future?
I'm working on finishing my book on repatriation of potato varieties to the Andes. I call it milieu of memory, reclaiming, diversity in the Andes. And I think what I'd like to, how should I say this? What I'd like to talk about in that book are many kind of important and unresolved issues, not with a view of resolving them, but with a view of just kind of seeing, the different aspects. For example, Pierre Nora talks about sites in milieu of memory, and I've used his work a lot. So then I talk about milieu of memory as, the kitchen, the home garden, the small communities and all that. And then there's the potato park, which is where they're repatriating the supposedly lost, and that's a whole different discussion, supposedly lost varieties from the gene bank to the place. And actually they're complementing it with recuperation of culinary traditions, recuperation of traditional intellectual property, so on and so forth. So one question that comes to mind, and again, like I said, this is unresolved and probably not to be resolved anytime soon, is what is the potato park? Is it milieu or is it site? And also, in modernity, when women in Ecuador no longer have the time to cook their sopas for the whole day, and Nadia Saremitakis talks about the grandmother at the farm that renews all the memories for the grandchild. If the grandmother is no longer there, or the grandmother is no longer accessible to the grandchild, when modernity modernizes our places, kitchens and time and space and so on, are we going to be very adamant about milieu and sites? Or are we going to admit that sites are needed and that sites function as milieu sometimes? Like, for example, again, my focus is the potato park. Because people come there and people who, people see that the potatoes are being conserved. So in the absence of rustic kitchens and in the absence of diverse home gardens, do the sites, supposed to be sites, museums, heritage parks, so on and so forth, do they provide a certain necessary function in order to enliven that memory? I also think about Ernest Bloch, philosopher who was a Marxist humanist philosopher, and he talked about fairy tales. And the Marxist folks, of course, kind of castigated him for that. I mean, why would you talk about romance and prayer books and Bibles? I mean, what's the use of that? But Ernest Bloch talked about fairy tales as like a vision of what's possible. So yeah, I'm working through these things. should we not tolerate visions of what's possible?
That's right.
Should we not tolerate fairy tales?
That's right. Well, that's a wonderful place to stop. I'm sure we'll all be looking forward to what you come up with in that project. And it's been such a pleasure to have this time to really dig deeper into your work and understand its fascinating combination of these different anthropological streams. And so thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for coming all this way, David. And as you know, I mean, your work has also been very influential to my work, and really a driving force in having an oven and a refrigerator right beside the herbarium cabinets in my lab.
oh, well, thank you. Thanks. It's been lovely.